Imagine being told that to save your child's life, you must first destroy part of them. That to bring good fortune, you must endure unimaginable pain. That to honor the gods, you must risk everything you hold dear. Welcome to the darkest corners of human tradition, where love and brutality dance together in rituals that defy logic, yet somehow make perfect sense to those who practice them. You're about to discover 10 of the most shocking traditions ever created by human civilization. From children trampled by sacred bulls to families firing rockets at each other's faces, from voluntary starvation to death-defying leaps onto concrete, these aren't acts of madness. They're acts of desperate faith, performed by people who believed that inflicting temporary suffering could prevent eternal catastrophe. But here's what will disturb you most. Every single one of these brutal traditions was designed to do good, to protect, to heal, to bring prosperity, to honor the divine. The people who created them weren't monsters. They were parents, leaders, and communities doing everything they could to shield their loved ones from forces they couldn't understand or control. Our journey begins in the remote highlands of Ethiopia, where the screams of a 6-month-old baby echo across ancient valleys. The child's crime? Being born with a tooth already visible. The punishment? Immediate extraction with a rusty blade, no anesthesia, no mercy. You witness the Mingi tradition in its raw, terrifying reality. A mother holds her infant as the village elder raises the knife. The baby, marked as cursed from birth, has brought supernatural danger to the entire community. In 3 seconds, everything this family believes about protection, love, and survival will be tested. The elder's blade moves swiftly, and the offensive tooth is removed in a spray of blood and infant tears. But this is not random cruelty. The Omo Valley tribes developed this practice after centuries of watching children die mysteriously. They observed patterns that would chill any parent's heart. Babies born with teeth, twins, children born feet first, or those whose upper teeth emerged before lower ones seemed to bring waves of death to their communities. In villages where half of all children never reached age 5, any sign that might predict or prevent catastrophe became sacred, unquestionable law. The brutal logic was inescapable. Remove the cursed element before it could destroy everyone. Extract the evil tooth before supernatural forces claimed not just the marked child, but siblings, parents, neighbors, entire bloodlines. The temporary agony of one infant could save dozens of lives. How could any community choose differently? What makes this tradition heartbreaking beyond words is recent anthropological research. The mysterious child deaths that originally sparked Mingi beliefs were caused by malnutrition, untreated infections, and genetic conditions that modern medicine handles routinely. The very signs they feared, early tooth eruption, twin births, unusual presentations, were often indicators of normal genetic variation or treatable medical conditions. Their observations were accurate. These children did face higher mortality rates. But their interpretation was tragically backwards. They weren't witnessing supernatural curses. They were seeing symptoms of poverty, disease, and genetic diversity that their isolated communities couldn't comprehend or treat. The tooth extraction, performed with unsterilized tools and no medical knowledge, probably increased infection risks rather than reducing them. The children they were desperately trying to save were being endangered by the very rituals designed to protect them. Love had become its own worst enemy. Today, as modern medicine penetrates these remote regions, the Mingi tradition faces extinction. Younger generations, educated about genetics and infection control, question whether tooth extraction and child abandonment actually help anyone. But for elders who have performed these rituals for decades, abandoning Mingi practices feels like abandoning their children to supernatural forces they still cannot fully dismiss. You stand at the collision point of two realities, one that sees bacteria and genetic variation, another that sees spirits and cosmic justice. Both represent desperate attempts to protect children from death. Both carry the crushing weight of parental love and primal terror, that transcends culture, education, and time itself. The screaming stops. The child, tooth removed and mouth bleeding, is welcomed back into the community's protective embrace. In their eyes, a curse has been lifted and catastrophe averted. In yours, a tradition born from love and ignorance continues its ancient war against forces no human fully understands. This is just the beginning. 9 more traditions await, each more shocking than the last, each revealing humanity's endless capacity for both breathtaking cruelty and heartbreaking devotion. The pig's terrified squeals pierce the morning air as dozens of machetes glint in the Romanian sunlight. You stand among villagers whose faces show no cruelty, only solemn determination. Today, they will commit acts that would horrify urban sensibilities, all in the name of survival, tradition, and preparing for the harshest months their ancestors ever knew. Welcome to Ignat, the traditional pig slaughter festival that has defined Romanian winter preparation for over 1,000 years. You watch as families who have raised these animals with tender care for months suddenly transform into efficient executioners. The contradiction is jarring, almost incomprehensible. The same hands that fed and sheltered these creatures now end their lives with ritualistic precision. But this is not mindless violence. You're witnessing one of humanity's oldest survival strategies, dressed in ceremony and community bonding. In the brutal winters of Eastern Europe, families who failed to properly preserve meat faced starvation before spring returned. The pig slaughter festival wasn't just about killing animals. It was about death, defeating death, sacrifice ensuring survival. The ritual begins before dawn. Extended families gather in courtyards where the condemned pigs wait, unaware of their fate. Children as young as 6 watch intently as their grandparents sharpen blades and prepare boiling water. This is their education in mortality, responsibility, and the harsh realities their ancestors faced every winter for centuries. The actual slaughter happens with shocking speed and coordination. Multiple family members hold the pig while one person makes the killing cut. The animal's blood is immediately caught in bowls. Nothing can be wasted. Within minutes, what was a living, breathing creature becomes raw material for survival. The efficiency is born from necessity, refined across generations who understood that squeamishness meant starvation. What follows transforms horror into something almost sacred. Every part of the pig is used with reverence that borders on worship. The blood becomes sausages. The organs become traditional dishes. The fat becomes lard for cooking and preservation. Even the bones are boiled for nutrition and gelatin. You realize you're not watching wasteful brutality. You're observing a masterclass in sustainable living that modern society has forgotten. The festival's timing reveals its true purpose. Ignat occurs in early winter when temperatures drop low enough to naturally preserve meat without refrigeration. Families who successfully complete their pig slaughter secure protein for months. Those who fail, delay, or show mercy face genuine hunger before spring crops become available. But the psychological cost is enormous. Children who bottle-fed piglets as babies must watch them die violently. Parents who named their animals and treated them like pets must ignore their emotional attachments. The festival demands that participants split their consciousness between love and necessity, teaching harsh lessons about survival that comfortable modern life never requires. The most disturbing aspect isn't the violence itself, it's how quickly children adapt to it. You watch 8-year-olds calmly holding bowls to catch blood, 12-year-olds helping skin carcasses, teenagers expertly separating meat from bone. Their faces show concentration, not trauma. They're learning skills their parents pray they'll never need, but cannot risk them not knowing. Romanian families practicing Ignat today face criticism from animal rights activists and urban populations who buy their meat prepackaged from grocery stores. The contrast exposes modern society's disconnection from food production. We consume vast quantities of meat while condemning those who kill animals themselves, preferring industrial slaughter hidden from view over traditional practices performed openly. Yet participants defend their tradition with fierce pride. They argue that their animals live better lives than factory-farmed livestock, dying quickly among family rather than in sterile processing plants. Their pigs roam freely, eat natural diets, and experience one moment of terror rather than lives of confinement. The festival also serves functions that transcend nutrition. Extended families scattered across modern Romania reunite for Ignat, strengthening bonds that urbanization threatens to break. Elderly grandparents pass ancient techniques to grandchildren who might otherwise lose connection to their agricultural heritage. The shared responsibility creates community solidarity that isolates modern individualism cannot replicate. As winter deepens and preserved meat sustains these families through cold months, the brutal necessity of Ignat becomes clear. Every sausage represents foresight. Every jar of preserved fat represents planning. Every shared meal represents the community bonds that made survival possible when nature offered no mercy. But you cannot escape the central horror, that love and violence intertwine so completely in human survival, that caring for something inevitably leads to killing it, that preparation for life requires intimate familiarity with death. The sun sets over emptied pig pens as families feast on fresh meat, their survival secured for another winter. Tomorrow they will mourn the animals they killed today. But tonight they celebrate life purchased through death, community strengthened through shared brutality, and traditions that kept their ancestors alive when gentleness meant extinction. The next tradition makes pig slaughter look merciful by comparison. The children's skin splits open under the scorching Peruvian sun as thorny branches rake across their backs. Blood mixes with dust in the town square where 100 villagers have gathered to commit acts that would constitute child abuse in any other context. But this is not abuse. This is prayer made flesh, desperation given form, the final bargain with gods who have abandoned their fields to drought. You witness La Esperanza, the rain ceremony that has haunted the Andean highlands for 5 centuries. Children as young as 7 volunteer to be whipped with thorny branches until their backs stream blood. Adults follow, lashing themselves with increasing violence as the ceremony builds toward its brutal crescendo. The goal is simple: cause enough human suffering to move the gods to compassion, to trade mortal pain for divine mercy. The ceremony erupts from desperation so profound, it rewrites moral boundaries. You stand in communities where the rains have failed for months, where crops wither in fields that once fed entire villages. Wells run dry, livestock collapse from thirst. Elderly grandparents remember stories their own grandparents told about droughts that killed thousands, leaving only bones scattered across barren landscape. In this context, the whipping of children becomes logical, even loving. Parents who cannot feed their families face an impossible equation: endure the unbearable sight of their children bleeding now, or watch them starve slowly over coming months. The immediate pain of thorns seems merciful compared to the prolonged agony of famine that drought inevitably brings. The ceremony follows patterns established centuries ago when Spanish colonizers merged Catholic ritual with indigenous rain-calling traditions. The resulting hybrid created something more terrifying than either culture produced alone. Christian concepts of suffering as redemption combined with Andean beliefs about blood sacrifice to create rituals that push human endurance beyond rational limits. You watch as the whipping intensifies throughout the day. What begins as symbolic strikes becomes genuine violence as desperation overwhelms restraint. Parents who started with gentle taps find themselves drawing real blood from their own children. The crowd's energy feeds on itself, transforming grief into frenzy, fear into fury directed at an unresponsive sky. The children's responses reveal how deeply this tradition has shaped their understanding of suffering and responsibility. They don't cry or beg for mercy. Instead, they compete to endure more pain, believing that their sacrifice might save everyone they love. 8-year-olds demand harder strikes. 12-year-olds volunteer for additional rounds. Their courage is magnificent and heartbreaking in equal measure. But the most disturbing element isn't the violence itself, it's the sincere love that motivates it. These aren't sadistic rituals performed by cruel people. They're acts of desperate faith performed by communities that have exhausted every other option. When modern irrigation fails, when government aid never arrives, when meteorologists offer no hope, the ancient ceremonies become humanity's last resort. The ceremony's climax involves the entire community, forming circles around the bleeding children, their own backs torn and raw from self-inflicted wounds. They dance and chant ancient words in languages that predate the Inca, calling on spirits and saints and gods from traditions so old their origins have been forgotten. The air fills with blood, dust, and prayers that rise like smoke toward an implacable sky. Then something extraordinary happens. Not divine intervention, but human transformation. The shared suffering creates bonds that transcend individual families. The community that entered the ceremony as desperate individuals emerges as a unified force, capable of facing whatever comes next. They've proven to themselves and their gods that they'll sacrifice anything to protect what they love. Modern meteorologists dismiss these ceremonies as superstition, pointing out that weather patterns follow atmospheric physics, not human blood sacrifice. They're not wrong, but they miss the ceremony's true power, which isn't meteorological, but psychological. Communities that can endure La Esperanza together can endure drought together, sharing resources and supporting each other through the harsh months ahead. The rain, when it finally comes, validates everything. It doesn't matter that atmospheric scientists can explain the weather patterns that brought the precipitation. What matters is that the community's willingness to sacrifice everything preceded the relief they desperately needed. In their minds, cause and effect are clear. They bled, the gods listened, the rains returned. But what about the years when rain doesn't come, when children bleed and adults suffer, and the sky remains mercilessly clear? These ceremonies continue anyway, year after year, because the alternative, accepting that they're powerless against forces that control their survival, is psychologically unbearable. Better to believe that insufficient suffering caused the failure than to accept that no amount of human pain can influence the cosmos. You leave La Esperanza understanding something terrible about human nature. We'd rather hurt ourselves than admit we're helpless. We'd rather believe that love requires violence than accept that love might not be enough. We'd rather sacrifice our children's innocence than surrender our illusion of control over forces that dwarf our comprehension. The sun sets over a community that has traded blood for hope, innocence for solidarity, rational thought for faith that survives evidence. Tomorrow they'll tend wounds and wait for rain that may never come. But tonight, they sleep, knowing they've done everything humanly possible to save what they love. The next tradition will show you what happens when human sacrifice becomes even more literal. The coconut explodes against the man's skull with a sound like thunder, sending white flesh and brown water cascading down his bloodied face. He doesn't flinch. Instead, he reaches for another coconut, his eyes blazing with religious fervor that transforms agony into ecstasy. You watch from the crowd as he raises the second coconut high above his head, preparing to shatter it against the same spot where the first one split his scalp open. Welcome to the coconut head smash ceremonies of South India, where devotees literally beat themselves into unconsciousness as acts of supreme devotion. What you're witnessing isn't mental illness or sadistic ritual. It's love expressed through self-destruction, faith measured by willingness to suffer, prayers spoken in the language of broken bones and flowing blood. The tradition erupts during major Hindu festivals, particularly Thaipusam and local temple celebrations, when devotees seek to prove their worthiness to receive divine blessings. You stand among thousands of worshippers who believe that the gods measure devotion by the devotee's willingness to endure pain. In their theology, comfort breeds complacency, while suffering purifies the soul and opens channels for divine communication. The logic is brutally simple. If you ask the gods for healing, prosperity, or protection for your family, you must prove that your request comes from genuine desperation rather than casual desire. Anyone can light incense or offer flowers. Only those who love deeply enough will crack coconuts against their own skulls until blood blinds them and consciousness fades. You watch as the devotee's technique reveals years of practice. He doesn't simply drop coconuts on his head, he swings them with calculated force, ensuring maximum impact while avoiding lethal damage. The skill required is horrifying. Too little force wastes the offering. Too much force kills the devotee before the ceremony completes. He's learned to dance on the knife's edge between sacrifice and suicide. The crowd's response transforms individual suffering into communal ecstasy. Women ululate with joy as each coconut shatters. Children clap and cheer as blood streams down the devotee's face. Elderly men nod approval as their champion proves his worthiness to carry their prayers to heaven. The community's desperate needs, sick children, failing businesses, family conflicts, all depend on this man's willingness to destroy himself for their benefit. But the devotee's motivation transcends community pressure. You see in his eyes the same desperate love that drives parents to superhuman acts when their children face danger. His wife lies dying of cancer in a hospital they cannot afford. His daughter needs surgery that costs more than he'll earn in 5 years. Traditional medicine has failed. Modern doctors demand payments he'll never possess. The coconuts represent his final option, trading his own suffering for divine intervention in circumstances beyond human power to change. Each impact brings him closer to unconsciousness, and, he believes, closer to the god's attention. The pain isn't punishment, it's communication. Every drop of blood is a word in prayers too important for mere speech. His fractured skull becomes an antenna tuned to frequencies that comfortable people never access. The ceremony escalates beyond rational endurance. After a dozen coconuts, the devotee can barely stand. His scalp hangs in bloody ribbons. His eyes roll back, showing only whites. But he continues, driven by faith that accepts no compromise between total commitment and total failure. Either the gods witness his absolute devotion, or his family faces catastrophe without divine protection. Medical experts watching these ceremonies document traumatic brain injuries, skull fractures, and sometimes death from internal bleeding. They see self-harm that any rational healthcare system would prevent. But they miss the ceremony's deeper purpose, transforming helplessness into agency, despair into hope, isolation into community solidarity. The devotee's collapse marks the ceremony's climax. As he falls unconscious in a pool of coconut milk and blood, the crowd erupts in celebration. They believe the gods have accepted his sacrifice and will respond accordingly. His suffering has purchased divine attention for everyone present. His individual agony has become collective salvation. But recovery reveals the tradition's cruelest dimension. Whether or not the divine intervention manifests, the devotee bears permanent consequences. Concussions affect memory and judgment. Repeated ceremonies cause cumulative brain damage. Devotees who perform this ritual multiple times often develop speech problems, coordination issues, and cognitive impairment that renders them unable to work or care for their families. The irony is devastating. Men who destroy their minds seeking divine help for their families often become burdens their families cannot support. The very sacrifice meant to save everyone instead creates new problems that require even more desperate measures. Love becomes its own worst enemy, creating cycles of suffering that span generations. Yet the ceremonies continue because the alternative, accepting powerlessness in the face of medical catastrophe or financial ruin, psychologically devastates people who need to believe their actions matter. Better to risk everything on divine intervention than admit that love and faith might not be enough to save what matters most. You leave understanding that humans will always choose painful action over comfortable helplessness. We'll crack our own skulls before accepting that we cannot protect what we love. We'll trade our minds for the illusion of influence over forces that dwarf our comprehension. The next tradition reveals what happens when entire communities decide that temporary suffering might prevent permanent catastrophe. The 1,000-pound bull charges directly at you, its hooves thundering against ancient cobblestones as panic and prayer merge into a single desperate moment. You have 3 seconds to decide: dive away to safety, or stand your ground and let sacred horns and blessed hooves determine whether you deserve the luck you're gambling your life to receive. Welcome to the bull runs and cattle trampling festivals that transform ordinary humans into willing victims of livestock they consider divine messengers. From the famous running of the bulls in Pamplona to lesser-known cow-blessing ceremonies across rural India and Nepal, millions of people deliberately place themselves beneath the hooves of animals that could crush them in seconds. But this isn't adrenaline addiction or tourist spectacle. It's calculated spiritual investment. You're witnessing communities that believe divine favor flows through the most dangerous possible contact with sacred animals. In their cosmology, the closer you come to death beneath holy hooves, the more luck, prosperity, and protection you earn for the coming year. The tradition's roots stretch back millennia to cultures that worshipped cattle as earthly representatives of fertility gods and agricultural deities. Bulls embodied masculine power, cows represented maternal abundance, and both served as bridges between human desperation and divine intervention. Getting trampled by these sacred animals wasn't punishment. It was communion, a violent baptism that transformed ordinary people into vessels for supernatural blessing. You watch as participants prepare for their encounters with charging livestock. Families gather to bless young men who will run directly into the path of stampeding bulls. Mothers offer prayers, while fathers provide last-minute advice about timing, positioning, and how to fall to minimize fatal damage. Children too young to participate study every movement, preparing for their own future encounters with sacred hooves. The psychology driving these festivals reveals humanity's willingness to trade immediate suffering for long-term benefits. Participants aren't seeking death, they're investing in survival. In agricultural communities where crop failure means starvation, where drought destroys entire extended families, where disease strikes without warning or remedy, any action that might influence cosmic forces becomes rationally necessary. The actual trampling events are spectacular displays of calculated courage and inevitable carnage. Bulls released into narrow streets charge at speeds that give humans seconds to react. Some participants attempt to outrun the animals, others try to leap over them, but the bravest stand motionless and allow the sacred hooves to strike them. The sound of human bones breaking under divine weight becomes applause from heavenly audiences. What makes these festivals particularly horrifying is their democratic brutality. Rich and poor, young and old, educated and illiterate, all face the same hooves, the same odds, the same potential for blessing or destruction. Social status provides no protection when 1,000-pound animals decide your fate. The bulls recognize no human hierarchy except courage versus cowardice. The medical consequences are devastating and predictable. Every festival produces broken bones, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injuries, and deaths that communities accept as necessary costs for divine attention. Local hospitals prepare for weeks before major cattle festivals, stockpiling blood supplies and surgical equipment for the parade of mangled participants who arrive throughout the day. But survivors emerge with something more valuable than intact bones: absolute conviction that their willingness to suffer has purchased supernatural protection. Men who walk away from bull encounters with only minor injuries become local heroes, their luck validated by their survival. Families compete to host the most dramatically injured participants, believing that proximity to the divinely touched brings residual blessings. The festivals create strange inversions of normal social values. Cowardice becomes the gravest sin, while recklessness transforms into virtue. Parents who spend all year protecting their children from minor dangers suddenly encourage them to risk death beneath sacred hooves. The same communities that carefully avoid unnecessary risks suddenly celebrate the most dangerous possible activities. Modern safety advocates attempting to reform these festivals face fierce resistance from participants who view protection equipment and safety barriers as insults to their faith and impediments to divine communication. Helmets and padding might prevent injuries, but they also prevent the gods from properly evaluating human courage and distributing blessings accordingly. The festival's economic impact complicates efforts at reform. Thousands of tourists travel to witness these spectacles, bringing revenue that supports entire communities. Local businesses depend on the annual influx of visitors who pay premium prices to watch humans get trampled by livestock. Safety improvements that reduce injuries might also reduce tourist interest, creating economic disasters that rival the physical dangers they're meant to prevent. You observe the festival's aftermath as injured participants receive treatment alongside celebration. Broken ribs are badges of honor. Concussions become conversation starters. Scars serve as permanent proof that their owners possessed courage sufficient to attract divine attention. The pain validates the sacrifice, while the survival proves the blessing. But the tradition's cruelest irony emerges over time. The very luck people risk their lives to obtain often gets consumed by the medical costs of obtaining it. Families spend fortunes treating injuries sustained while seeking prosperity. Communities that can barely afford basic health care dedicate enormous resources to repairing damage caused by seeking divine favor. Yet the festivals persist because the alternative, accepting that they cannot influence the cosmic forces controlling their survival, remains psychologically unbearable. Better to risk death seeking luck than accept that luck might be beyond human influence entirely. Tomorrow, participants will return to ordinary lives, but they'll carry with them the unshakable conviction that they've invested in supernatural insurance policies written in blood and bone beneath the hooves of sacred animals. The next tradition makes bull trampling look like a gentle meditation practice. The rocket explodes against the church wall just inches from your head, showering you with burning sparks and the acrid smoke of homemade gunpowder. Through the chaos, you hear children laughing, mothers praying, and fathers shouting coordinates for the next barrage. This is Easter morning in Vrontados, Greece, where two rival congregations have transformed Christianity's holiest celebration into a pyrotechnic war zone that has claimed lives, destroyed property, and somehow strengthened faith for over a century. Welcome to Rouketopolemos, the Easter rocket war that turns the Greek island of Chios into a battlefield where divine love expresses itself through explosive violence. You stand between two churches, Agios Markos and Panagia Erythiani, whose congregations fire thousands of homemade rockets at each other's bell towers while Easter services continue inside, creating a surreal fusion of worship and warfare that defies every notion of Christian peace. The tradition began as a dispute that escalated beyond all reason and transformed into sacred ritual. Local legend claims that Ottoman authorities once confiscated the church bells to prevent Easter celebrations. Frustrated congregations created their own noise, homemade rockets that could announce the resurrection even louder than bronze bells. What started as religious defiance evolved into competition, then into the most dangerous Easter celebration on earth. You witness the months of preparation that transform ordinary islanders into weapons manufacturers. Families spend their savings on materials, turning homes into amateur munitions factories, where fathers teach sons the precise chemistry needed to create rockets that will fly straight and explode spectacularly. The knowledge passes from generation to generation like deadly prayers, each family guarding secret techniques that might provide tactical advantages. The rockets themselves are marvels of dangerous engineering. Built from plastic tubes filled with homemade explosives, they're designed to travel hundreds of meters with enough force to penetrate wooden doors and shatter windows. Each projectile represents hours of careful work, and launching them feels like shooting prayers directly at heaven through a trajectory of fire and smoke. But the true horror lies in the participants' complete acceptance of casualties as necessary elements of celebration. Every year brings injuries, burns, cuts, smoke inhalation, and occasionally deaths when rockets malfunction or spectators venture too close to launch sites. Yet these accidents only intensify the community's dedication to continuing the tradition, as if divine favor requires human sacrifice to validate the celebration. The war's logistics reveal how thoroughly violence has integrated with worship. Both churches install protective barriers and emergency medical stations while continuing to hold Easter services throughout the rocket barrage. Priests deliver sermons about resurrection and redemption, while explosions illuminate stained glass windows and smoke fills sanctuaries. The congregation sings hymns between rocket volleys, creating a soundtrack where ancient prayers harmonize with modern warfare. Children grow up considering rocket warfare a normal part of religious observance. You watch 8-year-olds carefully loading rockets while their grandparents offer technical advice about trajectory and timing. Teenagers compete to design the most impressive explosions, while their mothers pack first aid supplies for inevitable injuries. The entire community treats dangerous explosives as sacred instruments worthy of the same reverence given to communion wine and prayer books. The economic impact transforms an isolated Greek island into a destination for tourists seeking the world's most dangerous Easter celebration. Hotels fill with visitors who pay premium prices to witness rocket warfare, creating revenue streams that depend on maintaining traditions that regularly injure participants. Local businesses sell protective equipment alongside religious souvenirs, acknowledging the celebration's dual nature as spiritual observance and extreme sport. The war's climax arrives at midnight when both congregations unleash simultaneous barrages that turn the sky into a dome of fire and smoke. Thousands of rockets cross overhead in brilliant arcs, while church bells ring beneath the artificial thunder of controlled explosions. The sensory overload creates an almost hallucinogenic experience where the boundary between celebration and catastrophe disappears entirely. Victory gets determined by which congregation successfully hits the opposing church's bell tower with the most rockets, but scoring becomes impossible in the chaos, leading to annual disputes about who actually won and ensuring that next year's battle will be even more intense. The ambiguous results guarantee that the conflict continues indefinitely, each Easter bringing renewed opportunities for explosive worship. The tradition's defenders argue that their rocket war represents the ultimate expression of Easter joy. Celebration so intense, it requires dangerous expression. They claim that risking injury to honor Christ's resurrection demonstrates faith more powerful than safe, comfortable observances. In their theology, genuine devotion demands genuine risk, and the possibility of death validates the reality of resurrection. Critics point out that using explosives to celebrate the Prince of Peace represents Christianity's most obvious contradiction. They note that the rocket war endangers children, destroys property, and transforms sacred space into a war zone where accident victims require emergency medical treatment during religious services meant to heal spiritual wounds. But participants dismiss such criticism as missing the tradition's essential point. Easter celebrates victory over death, and victory requires courage to face mortality. Their rocket war forces every participant to confront the possibility of injury or death while celebrating faith that promises eternal life. The explosive danger validates the explosive joy that resurrection should inspire. You leave Vrontados understanding that humans will always find ways to make even peace violent, to transform even love into conflict. We'll risk death to celebrate life, endanger community to strengthen faith, and create wars to honor the ultimate message of peace. The next tradition reveals what happens when communities decide that voluntary death might be the ultimate expression of spiritual devotion. The elderly woman's lips have cracked from days without water, her body slowly consuming itself as family members gather to witness what they consider the most sacred death imaginable. She chose this, planned it, prepared for months to die by voluntary starvation, believing that conscious self-destruction represents the highest spiritual achievement possible for a human soul. Welcome to Santhara, the Jain practice of religious suicide through deliberate starvation that transforms death from humanity's greatest fear into its ultimate spiritual goal. You observe a tradition where communities celebrate voluntary dying, where families support loved ones through self-imposed famines, where the most devoted practitioners choose to end their lives by refusing all food and water until their bodies shut down completely. But this isn't depression or mental illness. It's calculated spiritual investment based on theological principles that value conscious death over unconscious living. Jainism teaches that souls accumulate karma through countless lifetimes, and most deaths occur while people remain trapped in cycles of desire, fear, and attachment. Santhara offers an escape route, voluntary death undertaken with complete spiritual preparation, allowing practitioners to shed their bodies while achieving perfect mental clarity. The decision to undertake Santhara requires years of preparation and community approval. You cannot simply decide to starve yourself. The practice demands demonstrated spiritual advancement, completion of worldly responsibilities, and often terminal illness or extreme old age that makes continued living a burden rather than a blessing. Families, religious leaders, and community elders must all agree that the candidate has reached the appropriate spiritual state. The preparation process reveals the tradition's sophisticated psychological framework. Candidates spend months or years gradually reducing their worldly attachments, settling financial affairs, resolving conflicts, and achieving states of mental peace that most people never experience. They're not fleeing life in despair. They're completing it with intention, transforming dying from accident into achievement. You witness the actual Santhara process as it unfolds over weeks or months. The practitioner begins by eliminating solid foods, surviving only on liquids while family members provide spiritual support and religious guidance. Gradually, even liquids disappear from their diet until only water remains. Finally, water itself becomes forbidden, leaving the body to consume its own tissues while the mind remains focused on spiritual liberation. The family's role transforms them into collaborators in what outsiders might consider murder. Parents support children through voluntary starvation. Spouses encourage beloved partners to refuse food that could extend their lives. Adult children watch elderly parents die slowly while celebrating their spiritual courage. The tradition demands that love express itself through allowing death rather than preventing it. The community treats Santhara practitioners as living saints whose voluntary suffering purifies everyone around them. Neighbors visit to receive blessings from people they consider closer to enlightenment than anyone else alive. Religious leaders offer guidance while acknowledging that the practitioner has achieved spiritual states beyond their own understanding. The dying person becomes the community's most revered teacher, but the physical reality is horrifying beyond description. You watch human bodies systematically shut down as dehydration and starvation trigger organ failure. The practitioner experiences kidney dysfunction, heart irregularities, cognitive impairment, and eventually multi-organ collapse. Death arrives through processes that medical science recognizes as torture when inflicted involuntarily. The contradiction becomes unbearable. Families who would never allow pets to suffer prolonged deaths from starvation celebrate human relatives who choose identical suffering. Communities that consider suicide sinful in other contexts venerate voluntary death when performed under religious auspices. Love expresses itself through enabling what looks identical to cruel abandonment. Modern medical professionals watching Santhara struggle to reconcile their training with religious practices that deliberately cause preventable deaths. They understand that IV fluids and nutrition could extend practitioners' lives indefinitely, but providing such care violates the spiritual framework that gives meaning to voluntary dying. Intervention becomes interference with religious freedom. Legal systems face impossible decisions when families request medical support for Santhara practitioners or when children report parents for enabling elderly relatives' starvation. Is supporting voluntary religious death a form of assisted suicide that should be prosecuted? Or does prosecuting families for respecting religious choices constitute persecution of minority faith traditions? The practice's defenders argue that Santhara represents ultimate spiritual freedom, the right to choose conscious death over unconscious suffering. They point out that modern medicine often prolongs dying rather than extending meaningful life, creating situations where medical intervention causes more suffering than voluntary starvation. In their view, Santhara offers dignity and spiritual purpose to deaths that would otherwise be meaningless medical failures. Critics observe that many Santhara practitioners are elderly, ill, or dependent people who might feel pressured to choose death rather than burden their families. They note that the practice can become implicit euthanasia disguised as religious observance, where social expectations rather than genuine spiritual calling motivate decisions to undertake voluntary starvation. The most disturbing aspect isn't the physical suffering, but the psychological transformation required to celebrate death as achievement. Families must restructure their understanding of love, care, and protection to support practices that look identical to abandonment. Communities must celebrate what appears to be collective suicide while maintaining normal social functioning. You observe the final moments as dehydration triggers delirium and organ shutdown. The practitioner's last words express gratitude for spiritual opportunities that starvation provided. Family members respond with joy rather than grief, convinced that they've witnessed enlightenment achieved through voluntary death. The community celebrates a graduation rather than mourning a loss. But questions linger long after the body cools. Can voluntary death ever represent spiritual victory rather than defeat? Does choosing how to die demonstrate ultimate freedom or ultimate despair? Can love express itself through enabling death? Or does love always demand preserving life regardless of spiritual consequences? The next tradition reveals what happens when entire communities decide that ritual violence might prevent cosmic catastrophe. The bull's horn pierces the amateur fighter's thigh, lifting him off the ground as blood streams down his leg and the crowd erupts in cheers. But this isn't Spain, and this isn't professional bullfighting. This is Costa Rica, where ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and teenagers transform themselves into improvised matadors during festival seasons, facing 1,000-pound animals with nothing but liquid courage and the desperate need to prove their manhood to entire communities. Welcome to Costa Rican bullfighting, where the goal isn't killing bulls, but surviving them. You witness a tradition that has twisted Spanish bullfighting into something more democratic and arguably more brutal. Amateur contests where anyone brave enough or drunk enough can enter the ring with animals specifically bred to maximize aggression and unpredictability. The fundamental difference horrifies professional matadors. Costa Rican bulls are never killed, which means they learn from every encounter, becoming more dangerous with each festival. Unlike Spanish bulls who face their first and only human opponent, Costa Rican fighting bulls accumulate experience, developing techniques and strategies that professional fighters spend years learning to counter. Amateur participants face animals that are essentially combat veterans. You watch as ordinary citizens prepare for encounters that could cripple or kill them within seconds. Construction workers practice cape movements in their backyards. High school students train with wheelbarrows, learning to pivot and dodge while their friends critique their footwork. Office clerks spend lunch breaks studying videos of professional bullfighters, trying to compress years of training into weekend preparation. But the true brutality lies in the social pressure that transforms voluntary activity into community obligation. In rural Costa Rican towns, participating in bullfights becomes a rite of passage that determines social status for decades. Young men who refuse to enter the ring face lifelong labels as cowards. Fathers pressure sons to risk death as proof of family honor. Girlfriends threaten to leave boyfriends who won't demonstrate courage with bulls. The festival atmosphere amplifies every dangerous element. Local breweries sponsor events, ensuring that participants consume alcohol before facing animals that require split-second reflexes and perfect coordination. Crowds bet on which amateur fighters will survive intact, creating financial incentives for increasingly reckless behavior. Local musicians provide soundtracks that drown out safety warnings and amplify testosterone-fueled bravado. The bulls themselves suffer differently than their Spanish counterparts. Instead of single dramatic deaths, they endure repeated trauma across multiple festivals, facing dozens of terrified humans who inflict minor injuries while learning to fight. The cumulative stress and physical damage create animals that are not just dangerous, but genuinely vindictive, developing personal vendettas against humans that make each encounter more lethal than the last. You observe the medical consequences that pile up throughout festival seasons. Local hospitals prepare trauma units specifically for bullfighting injuries, punctured organs, shattered bones, traumatic brain injuries, and occasionally deaths that communities accept as necessary costs for maintaining traditions that define their cultural identity. Emergency medical teams become permanent fixtures at bullfighting events. The economic exploitation becomes apparent as festivals generate massive profits for organizers, while participants risk everything for minimal compensation. Tourism companies sell packages to foreign visitors seeking authentic experiences, charging premium prices to watch locals risk their lives for entertainment. Beer companies sponsor events that depend on alcohol-impaired judgment to maintain their excitement levels. But participants defend their tradition with fierce pride that transcends rational risk assessment. They argue that facing bulls requires courage that modern life rarely demands, that the fear and triumph of survival create bonds between participants that no safe activity can replicate. In their view, communities that abandon dangerous traditions lose essential elements of masculine identity and cultural authenticity. The bullfights reveal how societies use ritual violence to sort individuals into hierarchies of courage and cowardice. Men who survive multiple encounters without serious injury become local legends whose social status exceeds that of doctors, teachers, or successful business people. Their scars become credentials more valuable than university degrees or professional achievements. The tradition's cruelest dimension emerges in its aftermath. Many participants suffer permanent disabilities that prevent them from working, while the communities that celebrated their courage provide no long-term support for their injuries. Construction workers with torn knees can no longer climb scaffolding. Farmers with damaged spines cannot lift heavy equipment. The same bravery that earns temporary social elevation often creates permanent economic devastation. Yet the festivals continue growing in popularity as young men seek authentic experiences that urban life cannot provide. In societies where traditional masculine roles have disappeared, bullfighting offers one of the few remaining opportunities to demonstrate physical courage in front of entire communities. The danger validates the achievement, while the survival proves the worthiness. The tradition also serves as release valve for social tensions that accumulate in communities where economic opportunities remain limited and traditional hierarchies no longer function effectively. The bullfighting ring becomes a meritocracy where social status depends entirely on courage rather than wealth, education, or family connections. But the cost accumulates over generations. Communities that valorize unnecessary risk-taking often struggle to retain young men who survive their bullfighting phases and seek safer places to raise their own families. The very traditions meant to strengthen community bonds often drive away the people they're designed to celebrate. You leave understanding that some communities will always choose dangerous traditions over safe alternatives because safety feels like surrender to forces that threaten their cultural identity. They'll risk individual lives to preserve collective meaning, trading personal security for social significance that gives shape to otherwise uncertain existence. The next tradition takes communal violence to levels that make bullfighting look like gentle recreation. The stone explodes against your temple with the force of a sledgehammer, sending blood streaming down your face as thousands of projectiles fill the air around you. Through the chaos, you see children as young as 10 hurling rocks with deadly accuracy, while elderly men coordinate attacks that would qualify as war crimes in any other context. This is Gotmar Mela, where two rival communities in Madhya Pradesh, India, transform a religious festival into a stone-throwing battlefield that has claimed lives, destroyed families, and somehow strengthened bonds between people who spend one day each year trying to kill each other. Welcome to the world's most violent religious celebration, where devotion expresses itself through projectile warfare and communities prove their faith by attempting to seriously injure their neighbors. You stand between two villages, Pandherna and Sawargaon, whose residents spend months collecting ammunition for a single day of sanctified violence that hospital staff and police forces dread with equal intensity. The tradition originated from a dispute over a local deity that escalated into annual warfare disguised as religious observance. Legend claims that the goddess Devi Sitala can only be properly honored through combat that demonstrates the devotee's willingness to shed blood in her name. What began as ceremonial conflict evolved into genuine warfare, where participants use military tactics and weapons that could kill professional soldiers. You witness the months of preparation that transform ordinary farmers into organized armies. Families stockpile smooth river stones, selecting projectiles for maximum aerodynamic efficiency and impact damage. Children practice throwing techniques with the same dedication other cultures reserve for academic studies. Adults develop strategies and coordinate attacks that military academies would recognize as sophisticated battlefield tactics. The stones themselves become carefully engineered weapons. Participants prefer rocks that fit comfortably in throwing hands while possessing enough mass to cause serious injury at distances exceeding 50 meters. The most prized ammunition consists of perfectly rounded stones that maintain accuracy through long arcs and deliver devastating impact when they connect with human targets. But the festival's true horror lies in its complete abandonment of safety considerations that govern every other aspect of these communities' lives. Parents who normally protect children from minor scratches encourage them to engage in combat that regularly produces skull fractures. Teachers who preach nonviolence throughout the school year provide tactical advice for stone-throwing techniques. Religious leaders who condemn violence in daily life bless weapons designed to maim fellow believers. The actual battle transforms the landscape into a war zone where conventional moral categories cease to function. Thousands of participants launch simultaneous barrages that blacken the sky with projectiles, while the wounded are dragged to safety by teammates who immediately return to combat. The sound of stones striking human skulls creates a percussion section that accompanies screams, war cries, and religious chants. You observe tactics that would impress military strategists: coordinated advances, flanking maneuvers, and concentrated fire patterns designed to overwhelm defensive positions. Participants use shields made from metal plates while wearing minimal protective gear that allows maximum mobility. The balance between protection and performance reveals years of accumulated tactical knowledge passed between generations of stone warriors. The medical consequences pile up with predictable regularity. Every festival produces broken bones, traumatic brain injuries, eye damage, and occasionally deaths that communities accept as necessary sacrifices to maintain traditions that define their religious identity. Local hospitals prepare trauma units specifically for Gotmar Mela casualties, treating injuries that would normally indicate attempted murder. But participants defend their tradition with arguments that transcend rational safety considerations. They claim that facing deadly projectiles requires faith more pure than any comfortable worship could produce. In their theology, willingness to risk death while honoring the goddess demonstrates devotion that peaceful ceremonies cannot match. The violence validates the sincerity of their religious commitment. The festival creates bonds between enemies that peaceful activities could never forge. Men who spend the day trying to crack each other's skulls often share meals together that evening, comparing injuries and planning next year's tactical improvements. The shared danger creates intimacy between communities that might otherwise remain isolated by geographic and economic barriers. The tradition also serves economic functions that complicate efforts at reform. Thousands of tourists travel to witness legalized warfare, bringing revenue that supports both villages throughout the year. Local businesses sell protective equipment, medical supplies, and ammunition, while hotels fill with visitors seeking authentic experiences of ritualized violence that civilized societies no longer provide. But the festival's aftermath reveals its cruelest dimensions. Participants who suffer permanent disabilities often lose their ability to work, while the communities that celebrated their courage provide minimal long-term support. Farmers with damaged vision cannot safely operate equipment. Construction workers with head injuries develop cognitive problems that prevent employment. The same violence that creates temporary brotherhood often produces permanent isolation. Children growing up in Ghatmar communities learn to consider potentially lethal assault a normal part of religious observance. You watch 8-year-olds studying stone-throwing techniques with the same focus other children reserve for reading lessons. Their casual acceptance of violence as worship creates psychological frameworks that influence their approach to conflict resolution throughout their lives. The legal system struggles to address traditions that involve thousands of people committing what would normally be considered aggravated assault. Prosecuting entire communities for religious practices raises questions about cultural autonomy versus individual safety that courts cannot easily resolve. Police forces often limit themselves to crowd control rather than attempting to prevent violence that enjoys broad community support. Yet reform efforts face fierce resistance from participants who view safety regulations as attacks on their religious freedom and cultural identity. Proposals to replace stones with less dangerous projectiles or require protective equipment meet accusations that outsiders seek to destroy traditions that have sustained these communities for centuries. The festival continues growing in intensity as participants compete to demonstrate escalating levels of devotion through increasingly dangerous combat. What began as ceremonial conflict has evolved into genuine warfare, where survival becomes proof of divine favor and injury validates spiritual commitment. You leave Ghatmar Mela understanding that humans will transform even worship into warfare when peaceful devotion feels insufficient to express the depth of their religious passion. 10,000 rockets explode simultaneously around your body as you stand motionless in the center of a man-made hell, sparks cascading over every inch of exposed skin, while the air fills with sulfur, screaming metal, and the prayers of people who believe that surviving this inferno will purchase divine protection for the coming year. Welcome to the Yanshui Beehive Rocket Festival, where Taiwanese devotees transform themselves into human targets for the most intense fireworks bombardment on Earth. You witness the culmination of our journey through humanity's most brutal traditions. A celebration where communities deliberately create conditions that would qualify as war crimes if inflicted by enemies, all in the name of religious devotion and supernatural protection. Tens of thousands of participants voluntarily subject themselves to rocket attacks that regularly cause third-degree burns, eye damage, and occasionally death. The festival erupts during Chinese New Year celebrations in Yanshui, Taiwan, where local residents believe that surviving rocket bombardment cleanses bad luck accumulated during the previous year while providing spiritual armor against future misfortunes. The tradition began over a century ago when cholera epidemics devastated the region and desperate communities sought divine intervention through increasingly extreme acts of devotion. But this isn't random violence. It's precisely orchestrated chaos that requires months of preparation and community coordination. You observe families constructing beehive rocket launchers that resemble medieval siege weapons designed to maximize human suffering. Each launcher contains hundreds of bottle rockets aimed at waist height, creating crossfire patterns that make escape impossible once the bombardment begins. The rockets themselves are engineered for maximum intimidation and minimum lethality, though the distinction becomes academic when thousands of projectiles explode simultaneously around human targets. Participants wear minimal protective gear that covers vital organs while leaving arms, legs, and faces exposed to direct rocket impacts. The goal is survival with dignity, not safety with comfort. You watch as ordinary citizens transform into willing victims of technological warfare. Shop owners close their businesses to stand in rocket bombardment zones. Teachers bring their children to witness adults voluntarily enduring what looks like torture. Elderly grandparents offer advice about positioning and breathing techniques that might improve survival odds during the coming assault. The festival's preparation reveals a community united by shared anticipation of suffering. Neighborhoods compete to construct the most impressive rocket displays while organizing medical stations for inevitable casualties. Local hospitals prepare burn units specifically for festival injuries, while fire departments position equipment throughout the target zones where participants will face rocket attacks. But the psychological preparation proves more complex than the physical arrangements. Participants must overcome every human instinct for self-preservation, training themselves to remain motionless while explosives detonate around their bodies. The mental discipline required transforms ordinary people into something resembling combat veterans before they ever face their first rocket. The actual bombardment creates sensory experiences that exceed human nervous system's ability to process rationally. You find yourself surrounded by explosions that blur the boundary between celebration and execution, where the difference between voluntary participation and involuntary torture becomes meaningless in the face of overwhelming sensory assault. The sound alone threatens to rupture eardrums as thousands of rockets explode in rapid succession, creating acoustic pressure waves that participants feel through their bones. The light produces temporary blindness that forces people to navigate by instinct and memory while burning projectiles streak past their faces. The heat creates localized infernos that test the limits of human endurance. Through the chaos, you observe expressions of transcendent joy on faces streaked with burns and soot. Participants who successfully survive the bombardment emerge with psychological transformations that justify every moment of physical agony they've endured. They faced their own mortality and emerged victorious, proving to themselves and their communities that they possess courage sufficient to earn divine protection. The medical consequences accumulate with every festival as participants accept permanent disabilities as prices for spiritual insurance policies. Rocket fragments embed in flesh, creating scars that serve as lifetime badges of courage. Burns leave permanent marks that identify survivors as people who've literally walked through fire for their faith. Eye injuries sometimes cause partial blindness that participants consider worthwhile investments in supernatural protection. But the festival's most disturbing aspect isn't the violence itself. It's the complete normalization of extreme danger as recreational activity. Children grow up considering rocket bombardment a normal part of religious observance. Families gather to watch loved ones voluntarily endure what appears to be systematic torture. Communities celebrate traditions that would traumatize observers from cultures where such violence represents warfare rather than worship. The tradition creates bonds between participants that peaceful activities could never forge. People who survive rocket bombardment together develop relationships based on shared trauma and mutual courage that transcends normal social barriers. The festival becomes a proving ground where social status depends entirely on willingness to endure suffering rather than wealth, education, or family connections. Yet modern safety advocates attempting to reform the festival face accusations that they seek to destroy cultural traditions that have sustained communities through centuries of hardship. Participants argue that eliminating danger eliminates meaning, that safe celebrations cannot provide the psychological benefits that make extreme risk worthwhile. The festival's defenders claim that voluntarily facing extreme danger creates mental resilience that benefits participants throughout their lives. They argue that people who can survive rocket bombardment can survive any challenge life presents, that the festival provides psychological preparation for adversities that comfortable modern life fails to anticipate. As dawn breaks over Yan Shui and the last rockets explode around exhausted participants, you understand that you've witnessed humanity's ultimate expression of faith through voluntary suffering. These people have transformed terror into triumph, danger into devotion, potential death into confirmed life. But questions remain that no amount of courage can answer. When does devotion become destruction? When does faith become fanaticism? When does love become the very force that threatens what we're trying to protect? Our journey through 10 brutal traditions ends here, but the questions they raise about human nature, faith, and the prices we'll pay for meaning will haunt you long after the last rocket has exploded and the final scream has faded into silence. You've witnessed 10 traditions that shatter every comfortable assumption about human nature, morality, and the price we'll pay for meaning in an incomprehensible universe. From Ethiopian children having teeth ripped from their mouths, to Taiwanese devotees standing motionless while thousands of rockets explode around their bodies, you've seen humanity at its most brutal and paradoxically its most loving. But here's what should disturb you most. Every single person participating in these traditions believed they were doing good. The parents extracting cursed teeth from screaming infants, the communities firing rockets at each other's faces during Easter celebrations, the families supporting loved ones through voluntary starvation unto death. They weren't monsters. They were humans like you, driven by the same desperate love and primal terror that shapes every important decision in your own life. The pattern emerges with terrifying clarity across cultures, continents, and centuries. When faced with forces beyond our control, disease, drought, death, cosmic injustice, humans consistently choose painful action over comfortable helplessness. We'll crack our skulls with coconuts before accepting that we cannot influence divine favor. We'll let sacred bulls trample our bones rather than admit that luck might be beyond human manipulation. We'll transform our children into weapons and ourselves into targets because the alternative, acknowledging our absolute powerlessness, proves psychologically unbearable. These traditions reveal the fundamental human equation. Meaning requires sacrifice, and the greater the sacrifice, the more powerful the meaning. A prayer costs nothing, and therefore means nothing. Flowers offered to gods represent minimal investment in supernatural relationships. But blood shed voluntarily, bones broken intentionally, children endangered deliberately. These sacrifices carry weight that comfortable worship cannot match. Consider the mathematics of desperation that drives these rituals. In communities where half of all children die before age 5, where droughts kill thousands, where unexplained illnesses destroy entire families, any action that might influence these catastrophes becomes rationally necessary. The temporary agony of tooth extraction seems merciful compared to the permanent catastrophe of supernatural curses. The immediate danger of rocket bombardment feels manageable compared to the cosmic threats that divine protection might prevent. But the traditions also expose humanity's most tragic flaw, our inability to distinguish between correlation and causation when survival hangs in the balance. Communities observe that children with certain characteristics die more frequently, so they create rituals to address those characteristics. They notice that extreme devotion sometimes coincides with improved circumstances, so they escalate their devotional practices toward dangerous extremes. They mistake coincidence for cosmic law, transforming random patterns into sacred requirements. The psychological mechanisms underlying these traditions operate in every human culture, including your own. We still seek control over uncontrollable forces through ritual behaviors. We still believe that sufficient suffering can purchase safety for what we love most. We still transform helplessness into agency through actions that feel meaningful regardless of their actual effectiveness. Modern societies have simply relocated these impulses rather than eliminating them. Instead of extracting cursed teeth, we spend fortunes on medical treatments that offer marginal benefits. Instead of standing beneath rocket bombardments for luck, we engage in extreme sports that risk life for psychological rewards. Instead of voluntary starvation for spiritual purification, we undergo dangerous surgical procedures for aesthetic transformation. The difference isn't that we've evolved beyond brutal traditions, it's that we've individualized them. Our ancestors endured community-sanctioned violence for collective benefit. We endure privately chosen violence for personal transformation. The pain remains the same, only the social framework has changed. What makes the traditional practices more honest is their acknowledgement that love often requires brutality. Parents who subject children to painful rituals admit that protection sometimes demands inflicting harm. Communities that celebrate dangerous traditions acknowledge that safety might require risking everything. Modern societies prefer to pretend that love and violence exist in separate categories, that good intentions never produce harmful outcomes. The traditions force us to confront questions that comfortable modern life allows us to avoid. How much are we willing to sacrifice for what we love? What prices justify the purchase of meaning in meaningless circumstances? When does devotion become destruction? And when does destruction become the highest form of love? Every tradition we've explored reveals humans struggling with the same fundamental terror, that we might be cosmically insignificant, that our love might be powerless to protect what matters most, that suffering might be random rather than meaningful. The brutal rituals represent desperate attempts to impose order on chaos, to create transactions with forces that may not even exist, to transform helpless victims into active participants in their own fates. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation is how easily circumstances could transform you into a participant rather than an observer. Given sufficient desperation, adequate community pressure, and the right combination of fear and love, you might find yourself holding the knife that extracts your child's cursed tooth. You might discover yourself standing motionless while rockets explode around your body. You might realize that the line between civilized observer and brutal participant depends entirely on circumstances you cannot control. The traditions serve as mirrors that reflect not what humans are at their worst, but what humans become when love meets powerlessness and terror confronts the incomprehensible. They reveal species-wide willingness to pay any price, including temporary abandonment of every moral principle we claim to hold sacred, for the possibility of protecting what we cannot bear to lose. Tomorrow, we'll explore what these revelations mean for understanding human nature and the future of civilizations built on comfortable assumptions about morality, progress, and the relationship between love and violence. You return to that Ethiopian village where our journey began, but now you see it differently. The screaming child, the bloody knife, the desperate parents, they're no longer foreign aberrations from a distant culture. They're mirrors reflecting the brutal calculus that lurks beneath every human love story, every parental decision, every community's desperate attempt to protect what they cannot bear to lose. The child's tooth has been extracted. The supposed curse has been lifted. The community celebrates while the infant's mouth bleeds, convinced they've traded temporary suffering for permanent protection. But you now understand that the effectiveness of their ritual was never the point. The point was refusing to remain passive while forces beyond their comprehension threatened everything they loved. This is the final, inescapable truth about human nature. We are the species that will choose painful action over comfortable helplessness every single time. We'll crack our skulls, starve ourselves, sacrifice our children, and transform our bodies into targets because the alternative, accepting that love might not be enough to protect what matters most, violates something fundamental in our psychological architecture. The 10 traditions you've witnessed aren't anomalies from primitive cultures that civilization has transcended. They're expressions of drives that operate in every human community, including your own. The same desperation that leads Peruvian villagers to whip their children for rain drives, modern parents to bankrupt themselves seeking experimental medical treatments for terminal diseases. The same terror that motivates Costa Rican farmers to face charging bulls drives contemporary communities to accept devastating environmental costs for economic security. We haven't evolved beyond brutal traditions. We've simply made them invisible, individual, and technologically sophisticated. Instead of community-sanctioned violence, we have elective surgeries that risk death for cosmetic improvement. Instead of ritual starvation, we have extreme diets that damage health for social acceptance. Instead of children volunteering for collective suffering, we have competitive youth sports that guarantee long-term injuries for temporary achievement. The fundamental equation remains unchanged. Meaning requires sacrifice, protection, demands risk, and love often expresses itself through actions that look identical to cruelty when viewed from outside the relationships that give them context. Modern societies prefer to pretend otherwise, but crisis strips away these comfortable illusions with surgical precision. Consider how quickly civilized people abandon civilized principles when survival pressures intensify. Economic collapse transforms generous communities into suspicious tribes. Natural disasters reveal how thin the veneer of peaceful cooperation really is. Medical emergencies drive rational people to seek supernatural interventions that they would normally dismiss as primitive superstition. The brutal traditions we've explored represent humanity at its most honest, rather than its most primitive. They acknowledge openly what modern cultures prefer to hide, that love and violence intertwine so completely that they become indistinguishable in extreme circumstances, that parents will inflict unimaginable suffering on children to save them from imagined dangers, that communities will torture themselves to maintain illusions of control over uncontrollable forces. But here's what makes these traditions simultaneously horrifying and magnificent. They prove that humans will never surrender hope, regardless of how hopeless circumstances become. The Ethiopian parents extracting cursed teeth haven't given up on protecting their children. They've simply chosen protection methods that outsiders cannot understand. The Taiwanese devotees standing beneath rocket bombardments haven't accepted meaningless existence. They've created meaning through voluntary confrontation with mortality. Every brutal tradition we've witnessed represents the same fundamental human refusal to accept powerlessness in the face of cosmic indifference. Whether the threats are supernatural curses, divine displeasure, or simply random catastrophes that destroy everything without warning, humans consistently respond by creating rituals that transform helpless victims into active participants in their own fates. The traditions reveal both humanity's greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. Our strength lies in absolute refusal to surrender agency, even when logic suggests that surrender might be wisdom. We'll face any danger, pay any price, endure any suffering rather than accept that we cannot influence the forces that threaten what we love. Our weakness lies in inability to distinguish between meaningful action and ritualized desperation. We create elaborate ceremonies around random correlations, then defend them with devotion that should be reserved for actual solutions. We mistake the psychological relief that comes from taking action for evidence that our actions produce results. Yet perhaps this weakness is also strength. Communities that maintain faith in their ability to influence cosmic forces also maintain hope that improvement remains possible. Societies that abandon such faith often abandon effort as well, accepting deteriorating conditions as inevitable rather than fighting for change. The brutal traditions force a question that modern comfortable existence allows us to avoid. What price are you willing to pay for the illusion that love can protect what you cannot bear to lose? The parents extracting cursed teeth are paying in their children's blood and their own anguish, The devotees facing rocket bombardments are paying in burns, blindness, and sometimes death. What price are you paying? And more importantly, what price would you pay if circumstances pushed you beyond the comfortable boundaries where moral certainty provides easy answers? You leave these traditions understanding that the line between civilized observer and brutal participant exists only in the safety of circumstances that could change without warning. That every human carries the potential for both magnificent courage and terrible cruelty, often expressed through identical actions that love makes inevitable and desperation makes necessary. The Ethiopian child has stopped crying. The tooth is gone. The curse in their eyes has been lifted. Tomorrow, they will tend the wound and pray it heals properly. But tonight they sleep believing they've done everything possible to protect their child from forces beyond human comprehension. And perhaps, in a universe where love offers no guarantees and meaning emerges only from the prices we're willing to pay, that desperate action represents the most human response of all.